This fear of centralized power, particularly in economic policymaking, means that the markets often don't work the way that we want them to, and there's no one to hold accountable because there's no institution responsible for delivering.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalism, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
From the fall of the Berlin Wall to the great financial crisis, the model of unfettered capitalism dominated the political scene, both in the United States and in most of the world. Free markets and limited government were supported not just by the right, but also by most of the left. After 2008, and especially after 2020, the music has changed. Not only are an increasing number of people questioning the wisdom of unregulated markets, but they are also envisioning a more active role for the state.
New terms are created to capture this renewed passion, which is emerging on both sides of the political spectrum. State capacity libertarianism, new industrial policy, and marketcraft. The last is a term invented by political scientist Kenneth Vogel to indicate that a core function of governments, comparable to statecraft, is market governance. The state not only lays the foundation for markets with the rule of law and property rights, but it also shapes the market economies through institutions and regulation.
Wait, Luigi. State capacity libertarianism. I haven't heard that one. Where did that one come from?
Actually, Tyler Cohen is one of the main proponents of this idea.
Oh, interesting. That's unexpected. I think he needs to come up with a better term, don't you? I feel like it's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, but we'll see.
Anyway, well, a new book in this genre called Market Crafters has just come out. It explains how businessmen, politicians, and government administrators have shaped markets for political goals time and time again. The book is a series of portraits from Jesse Jones to Lena Khan of people who shaped the markets at different times. The protagonists are not just left-leaning interventionists, but also libertarians like Alan Greenspan, or conservatives like Hank Paulson or Bill Simon, or simply apolitical businessmen like Robert Noyce, the co-founder of Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel, but most importantly, the father of the U.S. semiconductor industry. A core part of the argument is that markets are almost always shaped, even if we, in more modern times, have not necessarily acknowledged that shaping.
And what is making it even more interesting is that it was written by Chris Hughes, a Facebook co-founder who left Facebook in 2007 and now is finishing his PhD at Wharton and is the chair of the Economic Security Project, a leading nonprofit that is advocating for economic power for all Americans.
So we had Cliff Asness on our podcast recently, and he said that there's no such thing as a free market. And I thought that jived with your point of view very, very well. And I was wondering how you think about that statement.
I think, we have this cult of the free market, this idea that supply and demand determines everything from the price of pizza to how much you're going to pay ChatGPT to use its technology. And in reality, what we see is that most major markets in the United States are, if not managed, at least structured by the state directly. So banking and finance is an obvious one that's close to my heart and my own academic interests, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, airlines. I mean, we could keep going through the list of industry after industry. If you add them up, you're well over half of GDP. And so my point in writing Market Crafters was not to say that structuring markets is always good. It's just, hey, guys, we do this. These markets are not mythical and self-regulating. We got to learn how we succeed and how we fail so that we can do it better in the future.
So, in the conclusion of your book, you state that successful market craft requires a clear mission, a coordinating institution who can hold accountable, and the investment of power in that institution to accomplish its work. Can you elaborate on why we need those conditions?
When you see public policymakers managing and guiding markets towards a public goal, like making Americans richer, making their financial lives more stable, future-proofing against climate, That is market crafting. So I go through all kinds of successes and failures in the book. The upshot is that when we succeed, it tends to be because we invest in an institution, as you were saying, with a clear mission. So, for instance, the Fed has a clear mission: price stability and full employment. We give them a lot of power to do it. And then we give them the discretion, the bit of insulation from the ups and downs of the political cycle to succeed. And so these institutions still fail. The Fed is clearly not perfect. But on balance, when we invest in institutions with that kind of model, they're able to deliver on things like price stability, financial stability, and other bigger picture goals. But the problem is we tend to avoid creating these institutions in the first place. This fear of centralized power, particularly in economic policymaking, means that the markets often don't work the way that we want them to, and there's no one to hold accountable because there's no institution responsible for delivering.
So where do you stop, and how do you prevent market crafting from becoming a victim of the political process? The Fed in recent years became controversial, perhaps for having too active a role in the U.S. economy, both through quantitative easing and through keeping short-term interest rates, very low. And then the Fed also came under fire for its policies for meddling, some would say, in climate change and in other areas that people saw as outside the Fed's mandate. So whose market? Who gets to define the market, and how do you prevent that from becoming a victim of the political process that is then whipsawed back and forth through different administrations?
Well, the Fed has a boss. It's Congress. Congress decides what the mandate of the Fed is and what its tools are to get that done. And that's a work in progress. Like, the Fed was founded in 1913. Completely reorganized in 1935. And in the late 70s, Congress set a clear mission for the Fed for price stability, full employment, and moderate long-term interest rates. And the Fed believes that financial stability is as an additional goal that, while it's not in the legislation, is important to deliver on that mandate. And so you talk about something like climate change. Well, the Fed, actually, of all the global central banks, has been the least involved in thinking about the impacts of climate change. But it did make the decision in the late 2010s and in 2020 to start thinking seriously about how climate risk could change the nature of insurance markets, could change the nature of banking and finance, believing that was part of its mission. It set up internal kinds of stress testing exercises for large institutions to think about climate changes and catastrophes. It was not doing things like other central banks have done, like buying green bonds and this and that, because it didn't believe that it had the authority to do it. So what I'm trying to say is that you need these institutions that have the discretion to think about how to fulfill their missions. And when and if they overstep, that is the role of Congress, is to redefine what those boundaries are. In other cases, it might be the courts. In some cases, it might be the media. There are these methods of accountability that are important to have.
I think as an example of clear mission and clear practice, I'm not so sure the Fed will fit. And it says, yes, it has a clear mission. But as you said, financial stability was something that the Fed introduced in it and interpreted in the way they wanted. As you say in the book, they could have saved Lehman. They had all the authority to do so. They chose not to. It's not clear that they had the authority of doing everything they did during the financial crisis. They did. During COVID, it was even worse. They made up stuff that were justified by the political moment with a lot of arbitrariness. And Congress was quite silent, exposed actually. Dodd-Frank, to some extent, was an attempt to limit the power of the Fed to intervene, but failed because then COVID came and the Fed did with gusto what had done during the financial crisis in spite of a legislation like Dodd-Frank to limit. So to some extent, the fear of this power is that these powers are used in a way that is not necessarily aligned with Congress. And sometimes might be good, sometimes might be bad, but it's a little bit scary.
Well, there's a lot there. So just to start with the great financial crisis, I think you're right to say that the Fed improvised, and they made a huge mistake in the Lehman decision. as I go into detail in the book, we have this false dichotomy of like institutions have to fail or they have to be bailed out, when there are all kinds of examples of structured bankruptcies that prevent the kind of market chaos that Lehman provided. I mean, Alan Greenspan's own Fed a decade earlier had done that with the largest hedge fund in the world, long-term capital management. So that was a meaningful failure. And at the same time, the Fed as an institution that fall and over the coming months, working with Treasury and the Congress on the TARP bill, created a suite of programs that prevented even further financial meltdowns. Now, Dodd-Frank, you're right, was a very illustrative moment of what I was talking about earlier, where Congress says, wait a second, we don't want you to have the power to bail out any single one institution. If there's a problem, you have to create a facility that a lot of different institutions have access to. And even then, it is an emergency power that you had. And so later on, you saw, further on in the SVB crisis, it was working within the constraints of Dodd-Frank that the Fed and the FDIC and others responded to that moment. And in the COVID crisis, I think you're not exactly right. I mean, the COVID set of interventions and programs were audacious and big, but they were well within the law. And Congress even said, we think that we want the Fed to have this power, and we want it to go further and be the custodian for the medium-sized lending program that it created. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that these financial markets are not free. They're not working on their own. Like, the institutions of government are structuring them, not just in the bailout moments, in the moments of crisis, but in the moments that come after, the quantitative easing that the Fed pursued for years after the COVID crisis, all of the lending programs that existed. We have this vision of financial markets that are more stable, and we create a whole host of institutions to deliver on that. And that's a normative political decision, which has ups and downs. It's not good in and of itself, but it is a market that's well crafted.
But maybe I'm a little bit misled by the term market crafting, because it seems to me that you're talking about market entrepreneurs that shape markets. The term market craft, if I'm not mistaken, was introduced by a political scientist, Vogel, who meant politicians make the market work for everyone. I don't see Greenspan making the market for everyone. I don't think the Fed in general making the market work for everyone. In fact, I think the Fed, by and large, makes the market work for millionaires, not for everyone. So in what extent is the Fed a market crafter in the Vogel sense?
I don't think Vogel would say that the only way that market craft can apply is if markets work for everyone. I'm not even sure what markets, if any markets, work for everyone. I think that the point is that you can use public policy to shape markets in a particular direction. So we've been talking a lot about finance, but we could, I have several chapters in the book on semiconductors. There's a political goal. We need to make semiconductors here in the United States for national security reasons. And then you use public investment, to some extent, trade policy. You could use procurement. You could use stockpiling in order to support that industry, because you believe that market needs to be crafted, and in this case supported, to meet your political goals. And so, this is obviously a recent story in the Chips and Science Act that began in the first Trump administration and then was passed in the Biden administration, but it goes back way further. I spend a lot of time on the book looking at Reagan-era industrial policy, Reagan-era market craft, where the semiconductor industry in the United States was under significant threat from Japanese competition at the time. There you saw the creation of a new institution, this one called Cimatech, that not only had marshaled resources, but more importantly, brought all the major American manufacturers, not just of the semiconductors themselves, but of the components that went into them, to Austin, Texas, to coordinate, suspending the antitrust rules, to say that we want this kind of collaboration. And you got a breakthrough. American chip production was going down for years. And then by the time of the early 90s, we're back over 50%. And the Japanese were suffering. So, market craft is not just markets for everyone. In fact, when I see it working, it tends to be for a more concrete, specific political goal, which could be national security, financial stability, energy security, a lot of the different things that we can talk about.
You tell the story in the book of Robert Noyce and America reclaiming semiconductor supremacy. At the heart of this story is lobbying, the semiconductor industry figuring out how to tell Washington what it needed. So did you come away from working on this book with a more benign view of lobbying than most of us might have, or a view of when lobbying is good and when lobbying is bad, to reduce it to very simplistic terms?
So I think dialogue between the public and the private sectors is critical to making markets work. When that happens best, it's public actors who have a clear mission. They're talking to private sector actors to learn what activities that they're pursuing, what works and what doesn't work. Not like a proper being lobbied by them to privatize public gains or things of this nature. The devil is very much in the details. In the Noyce example, the national security infrastructure in the United States in the 1980s was quite concerned about losing American advantage for semiconductor production and manufacture. And they had an interest in seeing that industry be supported. And it was the Department of Defense that I think really leaned on the Reagan White House to pursue this industrial policy to support domestic construction. Now, it also was clear that Noyce and others were lobbying on Capitol Hill very effectively to tell people that they needed to do this, and in the White House, and it lined their pockets. That made their private companies like Intel, which Noyce had founded, bounce back from some of the challenges. And it accomplished the public goal from the national security perspective of producing these chips here at home. And so I think that kind of dialogue, you do need it to accomplish public goals a lot of the time. But, the market crafters, it's their responsibility to ensure that giveaways to the private sector are minimized. And I will say, in doing a lot of the research for this book, you see what we call classic capture, some, but it tends to be more rare than I expected. But that's maybe a result of the long-term historical arc of the book and not just the past few years.
So the last time I wrote about healthcare, I remember being really struck by a statement that a doctor made to me, and he said, or healthcare economist doctor, and he said, what often goes unnoticed is how we've societally constructed who gets to make money and who doesn't, and therefore that defines a lot of our healthcare system. And you write about healthcare as an example, for the most part, of market crafting gone wrong. So how do you take away any broad rules from the book about when market crafting is good and when it's bad, or what makes it go wrong and what makes it go right and create the kind of markets that we want?
Well, market crafting isn't good or bad any more than tax policy is good or bad, or competition policy is good or bad. I mean, these policies can be pointed in the direction of different sort of normative political goals. From where I sit, I think having a healthy citizenry that can live long and ideally fulfilling lives, that's a pretty important political goal. And I think most Americans feel that the current healthcare system is, I'm trying to use a vanilla term to not get the expletive warning on the podcast things, that healthcare markets are extremely challenged and troubled. And so I think we have to ask, why is that? And if you zoom out and take the long historical view, in all the research that I did, I think there was a pretty clear enduring answer. It is our fear of consolidating power in the federal government to deliver on equitable health outcomes for everyone. And what many people see as the big victory was in the mid-1960s, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. And I have to say, that when I started doing the research, that's sort of what I thought was the big victory as well. And these are important programs that have been massively helpful to millions, tens of millions of Americans. And they were part of a grand compromise where we said, we're going to rely on this balkanized piecemeal solution for healthcare in the United States. We're not going to provide it through a federal authority. We are going to provide some of it for the elderly through Medicare, some of it for the, at the time, indigent through Medicaid. Of course, that's changed a little bit now. And then everybody else is going to rely on private markets to provide them what they need. That kind of compromise set us up on this trajectory now where we have this piecemeal system, which gets us to a point where we end up paying roughly double of what other industrialized countries do for healthcare, with health outcomes that are, on par with others. So that's, I do think, a failed kind of market craft where our hesitancy to really invest state power with the ability to deliver on that promise set us up on this trajectory. And the one last thing I'll say on this is, it's no coincidence that this happened in the 1960s and the debates were very much tied up in the questions around race. Wilbur Mills was the congressman from Arkansas who was incredibly influential, and he and Southern Democrats feared most a federal government that would force white doctors to see Black patients or other kinds, or hospitals to be desegregated in the South. And these other things were what created a bright line for them to avoid creating any kind of institution that would have this kind of authority. And so for decades, who are you going to hold accountable when no one is responsible for delivering quality healthcare at reasonable prices to Americans?
We all agree that good market crafting is good. The question is, how do you prevent the bad one and you allow the good one? And so it feels to me that the current system is a system where, in general, it's difficult to have the power to collect all the power to do what a good market crafter can do, except in extraordinary circumstances. So my reading of the book is the time where market crafting is more successful is when there is really a crisis. Think about, of course, the Great Depression, the Great Financial Crisis, even the oil crisis. When it fails, think about Medicare, there is not really any imminent crisis. And so it's very difficult for Congress to find the strength to give so much power to one individual to craft a market. And it's also maybe more difficult to have an overarching mission. And so it's one thing that I got from your book, which I think is interesting and right. The successful market crafters are people with a very strong sense of mission. But it's easier to have that sense of mission when you are entering World War II and you need to build enough tanks to win the war than when you are in the middle of the peace and there are so many different interests that makes it difficult to have a single mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, crises are particularly galvanizing because people of different political outlooks often temporarily suspend their disagreements and are willing to lock arms to fight it. And so you see that in a lot of cases. One example, though, of where that crisis then creates a new institutional reality is in the energy crises in the 1970s, which are often scrambled in the collective memory because we think, in the 70s, oil and gas prices went crazy and there were long lines, which is true in the second oil crisis in 1979. But the story at the beginning of the decade, during the Nixon administration in 1973, was actually very different. So I honed in on the story of this guy, Bill Simon, who is another avowed libertarian, a bond trader from Wall Street, who becomes Deputy Treasury Secretary in the Nixon administration and has no experience in energy markets and is given that portfolio because he doesn't have all these different political interests pulling him in a lot of directions. And then in the fall of 1973, the Yom Kippur War begins and the oil embargo occurs. American oil prices had already been going up because domestic production had been going down. But talk about a crisis. This is a real crisis moment. People worry that home heating oil was still a primary method of heating homes in New England. If you could not get enough for the winter, people could freeze to death in their homes. Gas lines might be a quote-unquote easy problem to solve. So that kind of crisis brought disparate political parties together, and ironically, the avowed libertarian becomes incredibly successful at using state power to allocate resources, to stockpile oil and gas imports, to use price controls so that the prices only go up bit by bit over time rather than skyrocketing as they did in a lot of Western Europe. He's very successful, but out of that effort comes the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So what I'm trying to say is we have this institution that comes out of a crisis now well over 50 years ago, which endures and is one of the key reasons that energy stability has been so important. So crises are galvanizing moments, but out of them can come this kind of institution building.
So it's interesting. Luigi sees the conundrum of the book as this crisis versus normalcy, where times of crisis versus times of normalcy, whereas I was thinking of the conundrum of the book as individuals versus institutions. So the irony to me is that you tell this story through individuals, and often very complicated individuals who might be more about their own personal power and self-aggrandizement, like Jesse Jones in some ways. So if market crafting is a path that we want to take or embrace, how much do we want to have invested in individuals, and how much do we want to have invested in institutions, and what are the limits on individual power?
Yeah, I think this is I like taking a historical perspective a lot of time, and this is one of the big lurking questions of history. How much does the person leading the institution matter, and how much does the institution itself matter? And then how do we make sense of the ideas that are circulating in the midst? My take is that entrepreneurs, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector, can make a lot of change. When you have a strong leader who has a clear vision and has the mandate to get it done, a lot can happen very quickly. And so that's why I call the book Market Crafters rather than market crafting or market craft, is because the people are ultimately the individuals who are driving the change. They need the institutions to have the power and the expertise and the networks to get it done, but the individuals are critically important. And so Jesse Jones is one that you mentioned, with the National Investment Bank that was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which lasted for about 20 years between 1932 and the early 1950s. And he is just this larger than life character. That institution, what we call the RFC, would not have existed with anywhere near the same kind of power as it did without Jesse Jones. And it begins by reinforcing finance and banking, saving those industries in a way where the Fed is not. And then in a middle period is working to spur housing construction and do direct to industry loans. And then in the war is responsible for so much of the armament, planes, synthetic rubber, pipelines carrying oil and gas from Texas to the Northeast, because all of our submarines were all of our tankers were being hit by German submarines. A kind of very empowered institution with a lot of resources and a lot of success because he was at its head. And so you need the institution, and in that case, you need the man. In fact, once he was gone, the institution frayed because it had not been set up for longevity. And I think there are important lessons in that an entrepreneur can sometimes go too far if the institution becomes synonymous with them. They have to think about legacy building and succession planning if they really care about the thing that they built.
I'm struggling to try to find some generalizable lessons. Maybe it's unfair, but the first one, as I said, is you need the crisis. The second, I'm not so sure I agree with the institution, is more that you need a powerful but a smart but independent person. So Jesse Jones, and no, basically axe to grind. He was rich, was part necessarily of one agenda in the housing market or in the war market. He wasn't representing General Dynamics or Martin Marietta. He was kind of a good American interested in American winning the war. Bill Simon, again, is a rich dude that, as you said, has nothing to do with the oil industry. And to some extent, that's the saving grace. When you have people who are more interested in one side or the other, they are too biased. So take, to some extent, Hank Paulson. Hank Paulson, nice human being, but not particularly successful in market crafting. He was too much of a world view in one direction to be a market crafter. Is that a fair characterization of your story, or am I reading too much into it?
Well, I want to make sure that I'm understanding what you said. You cut out a little bit, but I think what you were saying is that a lot of the most successful market crafters either come from business or have a lot of
No, but they are
wealth or privilege
independent.
or something when they come in.
They are wealthy, but they are independent. They are not representing one side. So Bill Simon had no stake in the oil industry. Jesse Jones had no stake in the mortgage market industry. And so the moment gives the mission, the quality of the man gives the opportunity, and the independence ensures this is not taken to a different goal. And also, I think Congress or the president, depending who appoints these people, is more confident that this is not misused.
Well, you definitely need people who are not doing the bidding of industry. I think, the market crafters that I focus on are the ones who are successful are independent, but for a variety of reasons. Some of them, like Andrew Bremer, the first black governor of the Fed, who helped cultivate the Eurodollar market in the 1960s, was a very independent actor who was the grandson of a sharecropper. And so the same thing goes with Brian Deese, who I focus on in the later parts of the book, or Lena Khan, both of whom come from middle-class backgrounds and who, are not affiliated with industry, don't have any other means. So I would say that I'm with you in that, the most successful market crafters have a mission. They know what they're trying to pursue. And that clarity of vision can be very motivating and animating for their success. So, so I'm with you on that. Independence is important, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that the independence can have many different sources.
Would you define Trump's tariffs as market crafting or not as market crafting?
They're market smashing. I think that they're so impulse driven that it is hard to see in the broad-based tariff policy market craft. Now, occasionally you see it. So the steel tariffs, they have a political goal. We want to support American steel. We want to do that for the jobs in that particular industry, and we want to do that for national security reasons. So that particular industry needs to be stronger. So here we're going to put a 50% tariffs on. That's a market craft. An across-the-board tariff of 10% on everything from avocados to Barbie dolls isn't a market craft. That affects markets, but many things affect markets and don't craft them. You see, tax policy affects markets but doesn't craft them. Investment in schools affects markets but doesn't craft them. So for it to be a kind of market craft, you'd need to have a political goal and then be using some of these policies of the state to pursue it. So for the most part, I do not see market craft in these more targeted tariffs. I do. In the support for crypto, I do. There's a belief that on the part of this administration that crypto is a important industry to support. I'm very much on the opposite side of that. And so I'm skeptical of it. But, the creation of the Crypto Reserve Fund, the directive to the SEC to take a different path, even, the president's own quote unquote personal activities around this, I think are very clear that they, want to see that market be cultivated. I think it's a good example, though, of just because it's a market craft doesn't mean it's a good thing. It can be pointed to less than ideal goals.
Exactly. That's one example of my point. In this particular case, it doesn't seem that President Trump is independent vis-a-vis crypto because he seems to have a lot of interest in crypto. And so that undermines the ability to carry sort of this power with some trust of the rest of the country, which makes it the job more difficult. But let me actually...
I don't know.
Let me shift gear because you're one of the founders of Facebook. And so I want to ask you, in what dimension do you feel good about what you founded? In what dimension do you feel regretful and you wish you had done something different?
I mean, the family of platforms that are all under the Meta brand now is so dramatically different from what I was a part of 21 years ago that it's difficult to compare. I left in 2007, a few months after Facebook had opened up, and went to work for Barack Obama. So the company just feels very foreign to me. And I wrote in a piece in the New York Times now 6 years ago that the concentration of corporate power in Meta had become a problem because social media and social networking at the time entirely consolidated. Now TikTok does exist, and they're fighting out this case in the courts around Facebook, whether or not Meta actually has a monopoly here. I continue to think that it does. I continue to think that structural separation is the best course of action, but I haven't talked to Mark since that piece in 2019, and so it feels pretty far away from my day-to-day now.
So a different version of Luigi's question is looking at the Facebook saga, or more broadly, the social media saga. Where should government have crafted the market that government failed to craft a market? Are there specific places in that? And then as sort of a follow-up to that, one of the things I'm thinking about and concerned about is it possible to see good market crafting in advance, or can you only see good market crafting after the market has played out? In other words, can you construct it can you construct it prior to the market, or can you only look back and see in retrospect what should have been done differently?
I think it really depends on the second. Congress crafted social media markets by giving blanket liability protection in the late 90s. So Congress said, we want these platforms to grow. And to do that, we're going to say that if you own the platform, you are not liable for what gets posted there. That kind of blanket immunity exists in no other industry. If you slip at the mall has some kind of liability. If you want to go to healthcare companies, if you want to go to product liability, we could have a whole little thing on tort law. That kind of blanket liability exists because Congress said that it should, believing that that was a key decision to make in order to support that market and have it grow. And I think that has been a foundational error.
Can I enroll you in a campaign for abolishing Section 230? Because I think that I agree
Absolutely.
100% with you. Okay, so let's talk offline.
Oh, absolutely. I've talked about this for years. I'm ready to, I mean, and what's fascinating on this is, the AI models, because they do not enjoy this liability, because their content is considered original or expressive content, they spend a lot of money preventing people from using the AI to create harassing content or to, strip a teenager of their clothes for a virtual image where you could see her or him being naked. The AI is obviously capable of an immense amount, and yet the industry has put very meaningful investments in making sure it's safe. It's not perfect, but it's a very different case study than what has happened in social media.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Big Brains. Big Brains brings you the stories behind the pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. Change how you see the world and keep up with the latest academic thinking with Big Brains, part of the University of Chicago podcast network. I had thought two things before I read this book, neither of which is true, and which I think on some level make the book more interesting, but also make it maybe less broadly instructive than I had hoped for. I wanted the book to say that market crafting is either good or bad, and it doesn't. But I think I also wanted the book and Chris himself to be a bit more prescriptive about that. And I can't believe I'm the one saying this, because I'm usually all about the stories first, and the book has so many good stories, but I wanted there to be more lessons about when market crafting is used for good ends and when it's used for bad ends, and how we can apply that to today's economy. Geez, that makes me sound boring. Luigi, what did you think?
I agree with you. First of all, you had a great line that he should have had in his book, which is basically the principle: who makes money in the economy is a societal construct. It's not something given by objective market rules or technology alone. It has a phenomenal series of stories that are very interesting to read. I think the book lacks a bit of a, as you said, message.
Yeah, I think it is really important to acknowledge that almost all markets are crafted. And even when you think about the freest of free markets, they're still dictated by the existence of a limited liability corporation, for instance, or by bankruptcy law in the United States. And that even the most ardent free marketeers would say, what do you mean, if you told them to let loose in a world without limited liability and without bankruptcy court, right? And so I think just Chris's baseline acknowledgement of that is really important. I was thinking that maybe there's a lesson here that maybe the government has to really explicitly craft, because what we did with healthcare, which is where that line of mine came from, clearly didn't work. This sort of weird combination of private market incentives and government policy has been a disaster for the American healthcare system. But then I thought even that lesson isn't broadly applicable, because that's exactly what we did with Silicon Valley and semiconductor manufacturing. It was a combination of Department of Defense money and US government policy mixed in with free market incentives. And I was searching for a distinction. Why did it go so wrong in healthcare, and why did it go so right in semiconductors? I don't know. Do you have an answer to that?
I think that the answer is that there is not an easy answer. And that's the reason why it's missing from the book, because it's very easy to see things exposed. At the time, if you give too much power up front, it's very easy for somebody to use that power for very self-interested reason. To some extent, at least the message that I extract from the book is that this mechanism in which the person has to grab power from Congress with a lot of difficulties is often good, because only when you have a clear mission and when the situation is bad enough, then Congress gives you this power and you operate, and makes it more difficult to waste this power or abuse this power in situations that don't have these characteristics.
But yet, the semiconductor industry, or even the entire development of Silicon Valley, would appear to fly in the face of that, right? I mean, I did anything about you? I think you were biased coming into this conversation in favor of the idea that this works best in a time of crisis. Did anything about the book or about the conversation change your mind about that?
I was biased. No, I think what changed my mind is that I thought that you needed people who were not self-interested, I would say. I think that the case Silicon Valley and the development of semiconductors is a very good counterexample. But in the case of the semiconductor, there was a crisis of, oh, we're losing out to Japan. I think you remember that moment in time where there was this big fear that Japan would take over the United States. And when later on, all the capacity went to Taiwan, there wasn't a sense of crisis. And so nothing was done. And I think the example of healthcare, in healthcare, we never face a major crisis. And that's the reason why we never had the ability to grab all that power and make all those reforms.
How do you think of the institution of the Federal Reserve through this lens? How much accountability should these institutions have? Right now, the Fed seems to sit at the nexus of this question of how much independence should they have? How much accountability should they have? I don't know. How do you think about that?
So I think I'm fairly critical of the Fed. I once made this proposal. It started as a joke, but I think the more I repeat, the more I believe it. Is you know that there is this systemic exception that the Fed cannot bail out all depositors unless there is a systemic exception. I said that as a rule, in order to invoke the systemic exception, the chairman of the Fed has to resign, because it's kind of an element that proves that something went wrong. The crisis became systemic because there was a problem. So somebody has to lose their job. I think it's kind of a nice sorting condition to reduce that risk. So now, it's very dangerous now to speak poorly of the Fed, because in an age of Trump, you want to defend the Fed against Trump. But I think historically, abuse a bit his power, and most importantly, has not been accountable, because at the end of the day, the Fed is politically independent, but very influenced culturally by the finance world. And so the objective function of the Fed has been much more aligned with the objective function of the 1% rather than of the 99%.
Yeah, so this is a little bit conspiracy theory and a little bit fact, but one of the fascinating things in the wake of the global financial crisis was the effort to point the finger at the SEC for what had gone wrong with the investment banks. And you had a number of really powerful economists writing op-eds saying that this was the failure of SEC regulation and the SEC's failure to rein in the leverage at the investment banks. And they blamed this 2004 rule change at the SEC for what had happened. When in fact, if you looked at it, the leverage of the investment banks was actually higher in 1999. So this rule change wasn't to blame at all. But I saw it, and other people saw it at the time, as this giant effort by the Fed, ginned up by the Fed, to basically deflect any blame for their own regulation of the big banks heading into the global financial crisis, and instead blame it all on the feckless SEC, essentially. And it kind of worked.
And let me tell you a little secret. That one of the reasons why it worked is because historically the commissioners of the SEC tend to be lawyers, and the governor of the Fed tend to be PhD economists. So economists are very sort of supportive of their own tribe,
yeah,
and they are much more critical on the other tribe. So it worked really well because the entire sort of group of economists form close ranks against the terrible lawyers.
But it is interesting to think about the Fed and through the lens of financial crises, because you obviously do want the Fed to have some leeway, a fair amount of leeway actually, so that it's not completely dependent on congressional approval in order to fight the fire of a financial crisis. But that question of how much leeway, it's a little bit like a version of don't ask, don't tell, right? We all want the Fed to be able to step into the breach when there's a problem, and we don't want to lay out the strictures beforehand, but then we want to pretend that there are strictures. I don't know. I think there is a lesson there more broadly about institutions that we might want to put in charge of crafting markets, which is how much power do you want to imbue them with, and how much accountability do you want to imbue them with? And I think there really is no great answer to that.
No, there is no great answer, because if you give them too much power, they tend to abuse. There's not enough of a discussion of all the cases in which this went wrong. And you mentioned at the beginning the mortgage industry. That's exhibit A of market crafting going completely sort of the wrong direction. And I'm sure that if we think for 5 minutes, we're going to find a lot more example like this.
I did think, by the way, that the conversation ended on a fascinating note, which I had never thought of. I don't know if you had, but this idea that the AI models don't enjoy the same exemption from liability provided to social media companies by Section 230, and that's going to force AI to develop in a different way than the social media companies have. I had never thought about that, and I don't know if that's something that you have actively been engaged with thinking about.
I think it's not completely new, but I think it's very important. What emphasizes even more so is how terrible Section 230 had been for the development of social media. That
Right.
Without that would have been a completely different story. Do you call it market crafting? Do you call it lobbying? And I don't know. I think that somebody should study who planted that seed in the legislation, because social media were really not existent at the time, and was the beginning. And what would have been smart is maybe a rule with some sunset clauses. So, because I remember at the time, for example, there was an exemption from sales taxes.
Right.
You remember that?
I do remember that. Yeah.
But there was a built-in sunset, because at some point we started paying taxes on transaction on the internet, and so the exemption could have been a good thing maybe at the beginning, but clearly was kept too long.
It's a really interesting question. If any of our listeners out there know, please feel free to email us, because we're really interested in this. So if anybody knows the genesis of Section 230, was it, speaking of conspiracy theories, was it actually a conspiracy theory by somebody with far-seeing ability about the power social media might have one day, and how to lock in that power in a way? Or was it just one of those momentary decisions that no one involved actually understood the enormous ramifications of it? So if anyone out there knows, I would love an answer to that.
But the thing that is for sure is that it did last too long. So whether it was planted by design or by accident, the ability to survive so long is the result of lobbying and pressures. And I think this is saying something about market crafting, that there is a risk when you put too much power in the hands of an individual. Unless this individual is above the fray, the risk that the rules will be crafted in a particular direction that is difficult to undo, I think is a serious issue.
Capitalism is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsof Gandhi, Matt Lucky, Sebastian Burka, Andy Shee, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to take our conversation further, also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center, and subscribe to our newsletter. Sign up at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler to discover exciting new content, events, and